What makes a chord sound interesting? Things like this. Are generally considered less harmonically complex than something like this. The latter example contains chords that break out of the key a little bit, and more importantly, are just more rare. But there's a subset of chords that anecdotally are so rare, there isn't really a mainstream comprehensive way of analyzing them. Today, I want to talk about some of these rare examples in video games, using a system of analysis I've been working on called Relative Axis Interchange. We'll soon take a look at how this method helps us group together seemingly disparate sounds, and justifies truly some of the wackiest chords you can possibly have in a tonality. You may have seen Axis Interchange before if you read the Wikipedia page I briefly made before the editors took it down minutes later. If you want to read more, I've since been hiding it in the personal life section of Andy Milanakis. Before we talk about axis interchange, we first need to go over modal interchange. In short, modal interchange is the idea that you can borrow chords from parallel tonalities. In the key of C major, we have 7 chords that are diatonic to our key. Let's make a simple C major chord progression using these chords. But what if we steal a chord that isn't found in C major from a parallel tonality, such as C minor? This 4 minor chord looks pretty nice. The possibilities are truly endless, as there are dozens of different tonalities with interesting chords. The main restriction of modal interchange is also its greatest strength. Modal interchange is explicitly parallel, meaning if I'm in F major, I can only take chords from other F tonalities. Otherwise, it would be hard to hear the relationship to the key. But being derived from a parallel tonic is what makes modal interchange such a strong sound in most cases. Our ears can often, at least subconsciously, understand the chord relative to our tonic. This is pretty much the most brief explanation of modal interchange, so I would highly recommend watching this excellent video by Music with Miles, which I've linked in the description. But anyways, I think of parallel modal interchange as kind of the sibling of what I like to call relative axis interchange. If you've been watching my stuff for a while now, you may have seen my video from 5 or so years ago where I talked about axis interchange in the context of the Owl House theme. I've since further defined and refined the system, plus I found some cool video game tunes which demonstrate it. To understand axis interchange, let's first draw a diagram. Let's just assume our key center is once again C major. Through the concept of modal interchange, we've seen how we can borrow chords from our parallel minor, C minor, while still staying in the key of C major. But C minor is also the relative minor of E flat major, meaning both tonalities share all of the same notes and chords, just in a different order, making them in many cases functionally the same thing, such as here where we're just borrowing a chord from this kind of space. In which case, we could say that in the key of C major, we can acceptably borrow chords from E flat major, a key signature that is 3 ticks flatter on the circle of fifths. For now, this is pretty much just regular modal interchange, but what if we go in the opposite direction? C major's relative minor is A minor, and much like how we can borrow from parallel minor in major, we can acceptably borrow from parallel major in minor, giving us A major, which is 3 ticks sharper on the circle of fifths. This is technically covered by modal interchange, but anecdotally, borrowing from parallel major in minor is way less common than the other way around. In either way, we often see these types of chords borrowed while we're in the major key, which can't be explained by typical modal interchange. Because of the symmetry of this diagram on the circle of fifths, there's one more tonic source implied. We can extrapolate the diagram from either side, either giving us relative minors, parallel majors, relative minors, parallel major, or parallel minors, relative majors, parallel minors, relative major, both of which being a tritone away from our tonic. Through this logic, we can justifiably borrow from F sharp major in the key of C major, E flat minor in the key of A minor, or any permutation thereof. It poses an interesting question though. Can our ears truly hear this as a valid source of interchange? We'll talk about that in a bit, but it's probably time we just listen to some tunes. Because of the wordiness of all of these vertices, I like to call our starting point the tonic vertex, the clockwise one sharp vertex, the counterclockwise one flat vertex, and the opposite one inverse vertex. So let's start with the most common vertex after diatonic, which would be flat vertex. Flat vertex interchange can be explained in most cases like modal interchange from parallel minor. So let's take a look at some tunes which do exactly that. Perhaps the most common chord I hear from parallel minor is the 4 minor. Let's take a listen to the classic National Park theme from Pokemon Gold and Silver. A quintessential example of how 4 minor can give us that wistful, nostalgic sound of being in major, but deriving flavor from parallel minor. Not every context of flat vertex is necessarily a downer though. Listen to how Miss Stralton City from Pokemon Black and White includes the flat 6 major and our aforementioned 4 minor, both taken from parallel minor. Argue due to the more upbeat nature of the track and more active melody, it doesn't have that same somber sound from National Park. Instead, both chords from flat vertex kind of feel grand and climactic, maybe with a slight hint of darkness. Very similar stuff to what happens in the classic Mario fanfare, which similarly uses 2 chords borrowed from parallel minor. So far what we've seen is all pretty common, but what about 1 minor in the key of major, essentially just our parallel minor chord? We can hear this in Summer's Eternal Tourist Trap from Earthbound. A pretty intriguing chord progression where we just bounce around the 1 major to 1 minor. I think it's notably harder to place the color as it's missing that super identifying flat 6 scale degree, which is found in both the 4 minor and flat 6 major. As a side note, research for this section was getting kind of tricky, as the chord progressions are getting more obscure. One of my favorite research tools and a website I've personally been using for years is Hooktheory. Hooktheory is one of the best music education websites I have ever seen. They have a crowdsourced database with tens of thousands of songs transcribed, allowing you to view the melody and chord progression while the song plays in real time. One feature which I personally use quite often is the Theory tab Trends page, which allows you to construct a chord progression of any length and see a whole list of songs which use that exact chord progression. In fact, many of the tunes in this video were found using this tool, such as the Earthbound tune we were just listening to. And on top of that, there are loads of other wonderful educational materials, like this page that groups together songs with similar chord progressions. And also Hooktheory's interactive music theory books, which cover beginner to intermediate theory using piano roll notation of modern music. Lastly, there's HookPad, a musical sketchpad that lets you bring your ideas to life with MIDI playback, helpful suggestions, and real-time music theory analysis. If you're looking for your latest source of harmonic inspiration, music education, or just want to browse a bunch of cool songs, check out Hooktheory and HookPad today. But alright, we've seen the 1 to 1 minor, which is major tonic to parallel minor tonic, or rather, major tonic to flat vertex minor tonic. A similar sound can be heard with the flat 3 major, which can actually just be thought of as borrowing our flat vertex major tonic. It's quite like the Earthbound tune in how it really just goes between our major tonic and a tonic from flat vertex, but perhaps with a bit more minor color because of the flat 7 scale degree found in the B-flat chord. But still, the lack of that flat 6 scale degree makes this chord progression feel a bit freer in its movement. To me, there isn't that kind of pull downwards you get from things like the 4 minor chord. We can even have flat vertex interchange in a minor tonality. Let's take a listen to this snippet from the Death Mountain theme from A Link to the Past. Chords move between our tonic 1 minor and the flat 3 minor. This could technically be thought of as modal interchange from parallel Locrian, but to me I really hear this as just a flat vertex jump, taking our minor tonality from a minor third flatter. At least I feel it as such, because the color difference between the 1 minor and flat 3 minor feels almost identical to the difference between 1 major and flat 3 major. This color thing is a huge topic in Axis Interchange, and I'll talk about that more later, but I actually found another example that features a more active melody, the laning 1 music from Dota 2. I like this example because whereas the Zelda tune moves the melody upwards in parallel motion with the chords, this features a more organic melody that really helps to feel that drop in darkness when you get to the flat 3. And of course the difference is so nice. It's almost like minor's minor, a melodramatic sound that really just fountain hooks you into Dota's vaguely dark fantasy vibe. But anyways, these chords are pretty much just the most popular flat vertex chords. There are still a bunch of less common but still viable chords you can borrow for that flatland sound. So let's now take a look at my personal favorite of the vertices, sharp vertex. As we saw earlier, sharp vertex is 3 ticks clockwise, or sharper on the circle of fifths. An easy way to think about this is, in a minor key, sharp vertex is just borrowing chords from the parallel major. One of the most basic applications of this is just using the 1 major chord in a minor key. Typically this appears at the end of the phrase as kind of a fake out into a brighter resolution, historically called the Picardy third in classical terminology. Almost all of the ocarina songs in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask do this. It's just a super cute, uplifting end to an otherwise minor tune. But there's still quite a few more interesting applications than just a major reharm of our 1 chord. Sonic Mania's Stardust Speedway, for instance, features the 2 minor 9, which doesn't really stand out on paper, but listen to how bright that chord is. Diatonically, we would expect the 2 minor 7 flat 5 here, which sets up that sub 5 nicely in this chromatically descending resolution. But not only are we changing our flat 5 to a natural 5, we're adding in the 9. The notes in this chord can only really be explained with sharp vertex. If it lacked that 9 and was just a standard 2 minor 7, this could be explained and felt as borrowed from melodic minor. But with that 9, C sharp, it makes it so this chord is pretty much only found in our parallel major, A major. This is a pretty interesting example because it's probably one of the most functional axis interchange chords. It still works nicely as the related subdominant of our following B-flat 7 chord, but it doesn't just feel like a functional reharm, it's this subversive burst of brightness that's so identifiable as sharp vertex. Another example of this kind of thing can be found in Fire Emblem Fates' Road Taken, which features this insanely bright 6 minor 9. This is our first example of sharp vertex where the borrowed chord isn't rooted diatonically. Our diatonic 6 in minor is the flat 6 major chord, which we actually hit directly afterwards. But the 6 minor's root, E natural, combined with that F sharp just rips us out of that G minor sound. It's also a great example of how much color flexibility you have when using axis interchange with modal interchange. In the first 4 chords, we start with our diatonic 1 minor, go to this brighter sharp vertex chord, back to diatonic with our flat 6, and then modal interchange from the slightly darker Phrygian with this flat 2 major. The resulting chord progression sounds spicy and complex, but is ultimately very simple in its construction, which I think is so cool. What I like about axis interchange is that it allows for harmonic complexity through relativity, rather than vertically complex chords with a bunch of notes. But anyways, we've seen sharp vertex expressed as taking from parallel major, but what about as relative minor's parallel major? This is where things get pretty interesting, as you're already in a major key, but you're taking chords from an almost hyper major space. Using this diagram, we can see that it's like taking from A major while in the key of C major, the former of which we know is a brighter key through relativity on the circle of fifths. We can actually see the major key counterpart of our previous example. The 6 minor 9 in minor becomes the sharp 4 minor 9 in relative major. For instance, in A minor, our 6 minor 9 is F sharp, and in our relative major of C major, that F sharp becomes our sharp 4. This appears as a color chord in Kirby 64's Ripple Star map theme. I'm really out of ways to say that sharp vertex chords are bright, but damn, this F sharp minor 9 just comes out of nowhere and shines a flashlight into your eyes. It serves the dual purpose of A major color while also voice leading nicely, giving our bass a nice chromatic movement between G, F sharp, and F, much like what we saw in Stardust Speedway. We can also steal the major tonic of sharp vertex while being in major, which translates as our 6 major 7. I realized I actually did this a while ago in the song Spin to Win from the rhythm game A Dance of Fire and Ice. Here the first 3 chords are diatonic to our key of C major, and then this A subverts that. Where we would expect the diatonic A minor 7, or perhaps the secondary dominant A dominant 7, we instead get A major 7. This is our 6 major 7, or the 1 major of A. Another example can be heard in the highly requested Don't Preheat Your Oven Because If You Do the Song Won't Play from Pizza Tower. It doesn't really get much more straightforward than this. We have our tonic 1 major 7, 6 minor 7, and then the brighter, borrowed 6 major 7. Despite the simplicity, this chord progression is actually fairly interesting, as all 3 chords have tonic function. The C is our major tonic, the A minor is our relative minor tonic, and the A major is the relative minor tonic's parallel major tonic. It gives quite a bit of ambiguity to the chord progression, as there aren't other functional chords that serve to establish any of these 3 chords as our so-called true tonic, with C, at least for me, just winning by default because it's the first. And that brings us to our final example of sharp vertex that I could find, and probably my favorite from sharp vertex, the flat 2 minor 7, or perhaps the funnier and more controversial enharmonic spelling of sharp 1 minor 7. This can be heard in Shogo Nomura's Goodbye Astronaut, which I made a MIDI mockup of to avoid being copyright claimed, but I've linked the original in the description. I just love how that E minor 9 just appears. The simple chord progression of 4 major to 3 minor is relatively stagnant and diatonic, and then the E minor 9 just takes you into a different dimension. I especially like how we don't actually resolve to the 1, E flat major, until way later into the tune. And though we yearn for that resolution, the only thing we have is that sharp 1 minor 9, or the 3 minor 9 of C major. If you have a particularly keen eye, you may have noticed that the E minor 9 is technically not entirely diatonic to C major, because of the 9 F sharp versus C major's F natural. If you're feeling particularly funny, you could say this is modal interchange from C Lydian. But to be honest, modal interchange of sharp vertex feels a bit too radical for me at this time, and I'm just unsure if the ear truly hears that. This isn't a perfect explanation, but it's kind of just the most intuitive tension to stack above the 7th in this case, as the flat 9 F would just sound a little gross. Either way, Shogo Nomura probably wasn't thinking about any of this Axis mumbo-jumbo and probably just heard the bright sound that could be provided by that chord, and then just threw a cool tension on top. But anyways, sharp vertex is cool as hell, and for how relatively frequently it appears, deserves the same recognition as flat vertex. But the same cannot be said for inverse vertex, our final axis interchange vertex. Inverse vertex is weird, and in my opinion, kind of theoretical in analysis and application. Inverse is at the very least 2 degrees away from your diatonic vertex. Whereas the other 2 are logical reflections of our tonality, inverse vertex to me feels always like an abstraction, a reflection of a reflection, the Waluigi to our Mario. This also seems to apply in practical application. In my experience, chords from the neighboring 2 vertices can be heard and recognizably belong to their respective vertex. Flat vertex typically gives a darker sound, and sharp vertex typically gives a brighter sound. But inverse vertex is on the exact opposite side. Does it sound hyper dark or hyper bright? The problem is, I don't have enough examples to have a sense of this myself, but I was able to find 2, one in major and one in minor. Let's start with the minor example first. In this snippet of the Slay the Spire theme, we're in the key of F minor and then have the B minor, the minor tonic of inverse vertex. This darker, orchestral theme features fairly simple chords without any sevenths or tensions. We actually start on our F major, with the melody implying a kind of Mixolydian flat 6 sound, kind of in between minor and major. This goes to our diatonic flat 6 major, then back to 1 major, and then our mystifying sharp 4 minor. It's definitely super unexpected and pulls us to this unplaceable, magical kind of color. To me, it's so far removed from our functional relationships and expectation that it would feel like a modulation, taking us into a different key if not for the following F minor anchoring us back in F. The following sequence is kind of cool as well, with the diatonic D flat minor and A flat minor from flat vertex, and then our 5. If you consider the F majors as our parallel major from sharp vertex, then this snippet actually uses all 4 vertices, which feels super rare to see. Weaving between these disparate sounds is very film score-y, efficiently creating these gripping color differences instantly, and especially works super well in this medieval fantasy type theme. Going to a much happier and more whimsical setting, we have Tale Song from the Dreamcast classic Napple Tale. This quirky little tune is the theme song of Napple Tale. The chorusy section features an otherwise pretty standard chord progression with simpler diatonic chords. But then we get this strange interlude of C major and D major before the loop, our 6 and 7 major respectively. These could otherwise be explained in a few different ways. Both of these could be secondary dominants without their sevenths, but to me they don't really have dominant function. Similarly, they don't feel like a planed sequence of constant structure, because it's just so fleeting and the pattern only lasts between these 2 chords. Instead, the C feels like a sharp vertex major tonic, and the intriguing D major feels a bit like it's from inverse vertex. In our key of E flat major, inverse vertex is A major, in which D would be the 4. But relative to our key of E flat, it's the wildly uncommon 7 major, or if you're super cool, the flat 1 major. All of that being said, it's kind of a tenuous explanation for a few reasons. It's fast and kind of hard to hear if the color really fits inverse vertex, especially given the prior non-diatonic chord. Also, these chords seem to allude to an earlier bit, where we vamp between C major and D major in a kind of Lydian sound. Still, I think it's worth mentioning because it sounds appropriately wacky and in line with how out inverse vertex sounds. And also because that's the last inverse vertex tune I could find in the wild. And let me tell you, I have been actively researching this every single day for a month to find tunes that do this. But we can still talk about some of the more theoretical applications of inverse. Assuming we're in major, these are the chords from inverse vertex, arranged so it starts closest to our 1 chord. Barring tensions, some of these chords can be derived from more common sources. For instance, the flat 5 major 7 and flat 3 minor 7 are most often heard as modal interchange from parallel Locrian. The flat 2-7 and flat 7 minor 7 face similar problems. Eliminating all of those chords, we're left with these 3, all of which notably containing the hilarious flat 1 scale degree. Let's take a listen to a short little tune I made to demonstrate how these chords could theoretically sound. Such a bizarre sound. I'm on the hunt for more inverse vertex tunes, so if any of you for whatever reason have major tunes which use flat 1 major 7, 4 minor 7 flat 5, or flat 6 minor 7, post them in the comments. The minor key counterparts are 2 major 7, 6 minor 7 flat 5, and 7 minor 7. For clarity's sake, there are some restrictions for what I think is considered axis interchange. Like modal interchange, I think axis interchange is in almost every case strictly non-functional, existing as at least mostly a color. Looking at that flat 6 minor 7 from inverse vertex, if we were to use it in, say, this context, it no longer sounds like a non-functional color, it instead sounds like a vehicle that pushes us towards F sharp major as our new tonic. Which brings us to probably the most common place I see almost axis interchange, when these chords are used as a modulation device to take us into a new tonality. It's a rather interesting concept to think about. As a general rule of music theory, chords operate on Occam's razor and always take the most obvious path to the ear. Let's take a listen to the following example. If I asked you how the middle chord functions, you would most likely answer that it feels like our 5. Specifically, it is a function relative to our key of C major and serves to pull us back to C, our 1. You would most likely not hear this as us modulating to the key of G major for one chord and then modulating back to C major, for instance. And that's only because of the cultural and contextual precedent. There are simply more instances of the former than the latter. Our ears would need way more information that precludes the former's explanation, while also justifying the latter. So why does all of this matter? Generally speaking, axis interchange, especially sharp and inverse vertex, are simply way less common than other, more functional devices in music. Especially when a chord can otherwise be justified using a more functional explanation, it's usually only axis interchange if we add disambiguation, such as proprietary tensions or whatever other contextual information. One last point when it comes to this kind of thing is that, like most music theory analysis, how a chord is heard, especially if it's from the relative axis, is quite subjective. I mentioned that culture and precedent is the driving force behind how we perceive a chord, and there are a lot of different cultures and precedents. Sure, there are contexts that are more idiomatic to one specific culture, leading to cliches and other genre-specific proclivities, but most of the time it's harder to say for sure what is most expected to be heard and felt. I'd like to use this last little bit of the video to acknowledge other analysis systems throughout Western music theory that can be used to analyze axis interchange chords, and hopefully also justify the existence of my relative axis theory. First, the most common is the idea of chromatic mediants. In short, a chromatic mediant is any chord that is a third away from our tonic, and chromatically altered to be partially non-diatonic. For instance, in C major, our diatonic 3 chord is the humble 3 minor, or E minor. But we can chromatically alter it twice, lowering the E and B to E flat and B flat respectively, giving us the flat 3 E flat major. Chromatic mediants can be used and have historically been used to explain chords like the aforementioned flat 3, but also things like the sharp vertex 6 major, the flat vertex flat 6 major, or even things like the flat 6 minor in a minor key. Similarly, there is neo-Riemannian theory. This one is a bit too dense to fully explain in this video, but essentially it is a means of explaining chords relative to each other as a series of chromatic transformations. For instance, C major to E minor can be analyzed as simply lowering C major's root, called Leittonwechsel, or an L transformation.
I don't understand German.
Combining different transformations allows us to be able to explain chord relationships that don't have much of an apparent function in our key, such as our chromatic mediants, or even chords that are more proprietary to axis systems, like our sharp 1 minor, which can be analyzed relative to our 1 as the elegant S or slide transformation in neo-Riemannian theory. And lastly, there is Berkeley's axis system, from which I've stolen the namesake. This is also a super dense topic, and unlike NRT, seems to only be contained in the upper-level harmonic textbooks at Berkeley. And seeing as my copy is somewhere in my parents' attic and I'm not about to fly to the Berkeley bookstore, I'm admittedly mostly just talking about this from memory. But essentially, Berkeley likes to consider that every functional chord has 3 counterparts on a diamond-shaped axis, each a minor third part. Chords on the same axis are the same in function, and the system can be used to analyze things like a flat 6 minor 7 as just a subdominant axis reharm of 2 minor 7, for instance. So if all of these systems already exist, why reinvent the wheel and turn it into a stupid octagon? Well, I think axis interchange fills a niche that can't be explained using the other systems. Chromatic mediants are sufficient in explaining how chords may be a reharmonization of their diatonic counterpart, but they feel like grouping together chords of similar color or origin on the circle of fifths, and do little to explain the relationship to the current tonality. Chromatic mediants are used quite a bit in film scoring as color chords, but there's no explanation on which chords provide similar colors. Meanwhile, axis interchange shows a clear relationship of every non-functional chromatic mediant to our key center, while also grouping together like chords by their origin on the circle of fifths, allowing us to see the exact color differentials in when we're borrowing from flatland or sharpland, or inverse land. Neo-Riemannian theory is excellent at explaining chords when the key center is ambiguous and the chords are mostly triads, but the system is tonality agnostic by design and also struggles with seventh chords and upper extensions. Axis interchange, meanwhile, shows each chord's exact relationship to our key both in Roman numeral and relative origin, which I think is quite important as in most contemporary popular settings, we're dealing with tonal music. Also, because we know where the chord comes from, we can see the theoretically most appropriate 7th and tensions, given neither are provided. It even allows us to differentiate between similar chords that other systems don't provide enough scrutiny for. 7 minor 7 is modal interchange from Lydian, but 7 minor 9 is axis interchange, as 2 minor 9 of sharp vertex. And lastly, Berkeley's axis system is great at demonstrating the relationships between seemingly diatonic chords and their non-diatonic, non-functional counterparts. But it feels a bit fast and loose, and doesn't adequately explain why an axis substitution takes its specific quality and tensions. But honestly, I don't remember it completely, so I don't want to slander Berkeley too much. In this video, at least. But anyways, that's pretty much the gist of axis interchange, and I hope you guys can use it as both an analysis system and a cool way to add some funky colors to your music. I've been working on this axis interchange theory for the better part of 6 years at this point, and though I stand behind the fundamentals, it can definitely still be continually refined, especially as it relates to modal interchange and further abstractions. If anyone has any suggestions or corrections to my analysis, or if you know of any other analysis systems which have overlap with axis interchange, please post about it in the comments. If any of you currently go to Berkeley, please spread my propaganda there. I'm sad to report the Harmony Chair has banned me from the premises and is beginning to see through my disguises.
I know it's you.